Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. It is Wednesday, April the 12th. This is the Podcast Daily. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. That's Bill Landis. Austin Ward is still a little bit MIA in the infirmary, trying to get better and ready for Ohio State's spring game weekend. Until then, as Bill said on Tuesday, you're probably going to get a whole lot of Bill and Berm, and we hope that that's not too entirely disappointing for you. If it is, I'm sorry, but this is just my face. Bill, it's Wednesday. It's a little different than a normal week because Ohio State's practicing Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We have Ryan Day press conference coming up on the podcast later on Wednesday morning, where he will take final questions from the media before the Ohio State spring game, the wrap of camp, the coaches clinic, which will take place in the Woody Hayes Athletic Center the next 2 days. A couple big days ahead for the program. And for fans who are hoping to figure out what the heck this spring game is going to be about and how it's going to be set up, Wednesday sort of the day. On press conference days on the podcast, we do our questions for the coaches segments, and Austin normally would be here. You can read his at ohiostate.rivals.com, where he wrote them out on Monday, at least a handful of them. Some of them were about injuries. We're not going to get answers to those questions, like how long is Steel Chambers going to be out? What's the situation as far as the procedures that he's having done or Xavier Johnson's having done? So most of these questions this week will be on the overall scheme of the spring game, the format that they're going to use, and what he expects to see or what he wants to see out of his specific position groups. So I'm just going to start because I'm already rambling. The first question that I would have for Ryan Day is the same question I asked you and Nicole and Bobby and Jay-Z on the live show on Monday, which is, what defines success for the quarterbacks this weekend? What are you looking for to see that someone, whether Kyle McCord or Devin Brown, did something or some things that you really thought were a step in the right direction towards naming a potential starter? Is there any chance that if one of those guys goes out on Saturday and completely shreds the defense, no matter which defense they're against, that they put themselves in a position to be the starter? Or is this just one more notch on the belt on the way to being named starter in August? That's sort of question one for me.
Yeah, I think quarterback is probably front of mind for everybody going into this. It certainly is for me. The thing that I wonder is how important of a data point that the spring game is. Like, I think in the past you've heard it's not like the real scrimmage. Like, the real scrimmage happens at some point before that, prior to the spring game, where they probably do more than they would like to do in front of however many thousands of people end up in Ohio Stadium on Saturday. I suspect it'll be a lot with the way that the weather's looking. It should be a pretty good day. And but I also think like there has to be something to the idea of, like, even if it's not elevated to being something more important than what Ryan Day has seen through the previous 14 practices, at least in my mind, it's like what you do when you're out there in front of, let's just call it 75,000 people, and it could be more than that, maybe it's a little less than that, but a not insignificant number of people in Ohio Stadium, I think is very different than what you might do on the practice field, even if it's not a real game. Like, the sights and the sounds are different. There's probably a much more pressure, even though it doesn't matter if you win or lose when you're on a stage like that. So how does Ryan Day kind of take all of that into account, or does he not do that? Is it possible to put too much on spring game performance? I think outside there certainly is. I remember a couple of years ago, people were like, "Oh man, this Justin Fields guy, I don't see it because he didn't have a great spring game." It was like, that was
he was 4-13, and people thought that he was not going to be any good. But I think that it is important, though. I mean, you brought it up. Like, if you're playing in front of fans and you're out there and people are, this is the first chance really for the fan base, which is, I think over the last handful of months, started to form opinions about who they think is going to be the guy and who isn't going to be the guy. This is the first chance to have those validated or invalidated, and that makes it sort of important, at least for public perception, of how these kids are viewed moving forward. Don't you think?
For sure. And I would say even that, like, my perspective on it has changed a little bit. I came in maybe thinking that, like, Devin Brown's, like, athletic traits were so pronounced compared to Kyle McCord's that would ultimately, like, be a trump card whenever this thing was decided. But then you get out there in the practice field, and we've had the privilege, if you want to call it that, of being out there quite a bit this spring to watch them practice, more so than we ever have before, which we're appreciative of because it allows more context. And then you get to see Kyle McCord move around and think, like, oh, well, that's not exactly the case. So the public at large has not seen that. So I think it will be good for whether you're, I don't know, whether you're in the Kyle camp or the Devin camp, or you don't care, you just want Ohio State to have a good quarterback. I think it's good for everyone to get eyeballs on these players, because especially for Devin, you've not really seen it. I guess Kyle did have that start a couple of years ago, but he's a different player now than he was then. So it'll be good for everybody to get that proper context that is probably still lacking from the conversation.
Outside of their parents, should anyone be in Kyle camp or Devin camp, or shouldn't everyone just want Ohio State to have the best possible quarterback? Is it weird? Is it weird that there's people? Parents, yeah. Is it weird that people have like created a preference?
Yes, I think that's like the nature of existing in the year 2023. It's like you have to have a hard stance. You can't nuance is dead. You can't sit on the fence on anything now. You have to pick one.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think it's weird that anyone has an opinion that's like so hard and fast. It's like, this has to be the choice. Like there's no evidence to support any of that. And unless you're living in the house with that young football player, I don't know why you'd care. Bill, your first question, what would it be?
I mean, probably that. I think it's
all right. Well, that's been a great show. We've enjoyed.
Right, yeah. I don't know if we like maybe moved off of that topic. I don't like what to make of Carnell Tate's emergence. Maybe like in a spring where Marvin Harrison Jr. is not doing a ton, and Julian Fleming and Emeka Egbuka and now Xavier Johnson have been out for basically the entire spring. Like someone had to step up and fill that void, and Jaden Ballard was that guy. Like he was kind of the hot name at the beginning, and that's not to say that he's like fallen off. I think he still performed very well, but like you just get enamored, I think, more with a true freshman like Carnell, and he's really seemed to take in the opportunities and run with it. So then what? And I'd imagine he's probably going to put on a little bit of a show in the spring game, just by the nature of like who's going to play and who's not going to. Someone has to catch the ball. I'd imagine it's going to find Carnell quite a bit. So if you take the full body of work, add what I think could be a pretty spectacular spring game performance on top of that, what does that mean for a guy like Carnell going into now his first summer as a college football player, and then ultimately his first camp as a college football player? Is there actually an opening, like the way that Ryan Day views the receiver room with everything they have coming back? Is there actually an opening for someone different to step up and take some of those targets? I'm skeptical that there is, but if ever anyone was ever going to force their way into that scenario, it probably would be someone like a Carnell Tate or a Brandon Inniss when he gets here.
Yeah, I'm skeptical also, but I also think that it's important for Ohio State to know that it has trustworthy insurance plans and insurance options at the position, because a year ago we saw when Jackson Smith-Njigba got hurt, the question was, okay, what now? And you put in a guy like Xavier Johnson, who people didn't anticipate could really play at that level. They found out he ultimately could, but as a walk-on, it's not what you want. You have these guys on scholarship, not, Xavier's on scholarship now, I understand, but it's not a player that you had pathed out his entire Ohio State career to put him in that position against Notre Dame and against Georgia and stuff like that. So it is insurance, at least for Ohio State, but it's also just a big weekend for these kids to go out there and prove that, the first 14 practices weren't a fluke, and it's their real first chance to step on stage in front of 75,000 or so people and realize what that's about. So I think it's important, but I agree. I don't think that in the big picture, it's going to have a whole lot of impact on what Ohio State does, because once Marvin is back out there full time, once Emeka and Julian and Xavier are back out there full time, it's Brian Hartline has said over and over, he is not going to play guys unless they prove they can do everything he needs them to do. So I think necessity has sort of been the mother of invention this spring when it comes to the young receivers. But they're going to have to prove that they can do all those things before they are called upon in those big time environments. Guys that are going to be called upon in those big time environments, we know that, and we talked about it on Tuesday's show, are the cornerbacks. Like, if I'm just curious, wondering how Ohio State is going to divvy up reps and playing time on Saturday amongst a group of people that you have three guys that you think don't need a lot of reps, but at the same time, you only have 6 corners, and you need to find ways to make sure all these guys are going out and proving that they can stay healthy and going out and getting good competition. So on a defensive unit that only has 28 guys or so that's going to be able to play this weekend, like how do you divide it up? What is the goal as far as number of reps for each of these guys, and how do you make sure that they're getting something meaningful out of the weekend without putting themselves in a position to do too much or or risk re-aggravating hamstring injuries or stuff like that.
Yeah, it makes me wonder who will be playing defense on Saturday that we're not expecting. Like Jake Seibert playing cornerback, or what was it, a couple years
Rowan
ago?
McCullough playing linebacker.
Yeah. In a world where they have 4 scholarship linebackers, they have 6 corners, as you said. Like there's a lot to work through there, which I think before we even know what the spring game format is, it almost guarantees that it's going to be offense versus defense like it was last year. Because otherwise, I don't know what you do if you try to split up the defense into 2 even teams. You don't have enough players to do it, which is fine. It's not worth getting worried about, but it does kind of force your hand. I have a question on the defense as well, and it's whether or not maybe Sonny Styles in particular, because Ryan Day sort of said at the outset of spring, at the very first spring media availability that he had, like Sonny is a guy when they think of like best 11, it's a guy that they think about in terms of like needing to get him on the field, and I sort of lump CJ Hicks in with him, even though maybe that's not fair given the different realities at their respective positions, but I lump them together because they're 5-star prospects and they're local guys, and I want to see them play. So has anything happened over the course of this spring to strengthen that feeling that you need to find a way to get those guys into the mix, or maybe pump the brakes on it a little bit because they are just second-year players and Sonny himself is only 18 years old? Like, if that were the case, it wouldn't be great to hear, but I don't think it'd be unheard of for young guys to still be working through things. But I'm just very curious about where those 2 guys in particular are in their trajectories, because I know I'm not alone in wanting to see both of them do something meaningful for this defense in 2023. And like, they don't need to have the answers to that right now, but you want to know whether or not they're trending in the right direction. So I don't know, maybe the most eloquent way to phrase that to Ryan Day to get an answer other than like, yeah, they're young and they're going to keep working and getting better. But I think that's something that's probably on the mind of a lot of people as Ohio State wraps up spring ball.
You know how Kirk Herbstreit does that thing every year where he talks about the guys who look best in the uniform, I think the reason people are enamored sometimes with CJ Hicks and Sonny Styles is because those guys belong on that list. Like, you look at them and they look like football players are supposed to look. And then you look at the rankings and they're 5 stars and they're from Ohio. And then you realize that if their trajectory goes like you expect, they're probably done at Ohio State after next year. And so like, there's this really small window where you're like, man, we just got to see what they can do. The question that I would have asked about defense is on that same vein. Like, have you seen enough out of CJ Hicks? And I don't say this about Sonny Styles because I think it's clear that they feel pretty comfortable with Sonny on the field, no matter what he's doing. I don't think that's the case yet with CJ, but I'm wondering how much they've learned about him in these last 3.5 weeks of practice nonstop after spring break. Like, what have you gotten? What have you seen out of him to suggest, hey, if God forbid Tommy can't play in the fall for some reason, if he misses a game or 2, if Steele's out, how comfortable are you putting CJ in that spot? I'm confident if you put him out there and just said it, as we talked about, go rush the quarterback, he'd be really good at that. But that's not what's required and expected of Ohio State linebackers every play. And I think that is the fascinating part about Jim Knowles acknowledging that he thinks CJ could be a potential fit at the jack position, because that is more of a go get the quarterback if you want to use it in that way. And I think that he is such a natural fit there that I'm really just wanting to know, have you seen enough to trust him through this spring to give him that opportunity come August? And so this is a big week for him, I think, because we know Steele's not going to play. That Tommy's not going to play. It's going to be CJ and Cody Simon lined up at the starting linebacker reps with Gabe Powers and Reed Carrico backing them up. So this is your opportunity to go out there and show people that you can make the splash play, which everyone knows CJ can do, but can you go out there and make the consistent play and make the solid play? I don't know that this is the right format to see that. It's not like there's going to be a whole lot of, ISOs and stuff like that happening where he's going to have to, knock off a blocker and hit a guy in the backfield. But it's just about making sure you know where you're going.
I do wonder that, because I feel like there are some things they need to learn, right, about those young linebackers, about the interior offensive linemen, not so much about their running backs, because they're only going to have 2 scholarship guys available for this game anyway. But is there at all a feeling that maybe you need to run the ball and be perhaps a bit more physical than you would otherwise be in a spring setting, because you have intrigue, I guess, maybe more than anything at those positions specifically. Because if you just line up and basically play 7-on-7 and pretend like the offensive and defensive line aren't there, then I don't know how much that tells you about a guy like CJ Hicks or Gay Powers or Reed Carrico. I would hope that they try to manufacture some situations where you can learn a little bit more about those guys. Only if to be instructive for us as we like carry these conversations on into the offseason, because I don't want to. The thing I try not to do is like talk a bunch about CJ Hicks and then have it be like for no reason. Like, or like I want it to be meaningful conversation about a guy who can actually impact things in the fall, and not just talking about a guy because he's a freshman that is really athletic and everybody likes. Like,
yeah, because he's on the Herb Street list. He's on the Herb Street.
Yeah, we want to talk about guys that can really impact things. Yeah, so there was that reminded me. Maybe the second scrimmage we were out there watching, they had a period of defense where I think it was a teach period, or no, it was an interception return period. So it was 11-0. There was no offense on the field. They were just kind of walking through some stuff. But on one rep, CJ Hicks, Sonny Styles, and Davis and Igbinosun were all out there together on the same side of the field. And I was like, yep.
Yeah,
I would like more of that, please.
That's the lineup you put together on college football. You're like, go ahead, guys. Put all the guys who are 6'3", 220 pounds, and run 4.5s, and just put them out there together and see what kind of chaos you can create. I think that's why Saturday is not going to be your traditional spring game format for people who are wondering. Obviously, the depth on defense is one explanation for that. The depth on the defensive line, the offensive line issues. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's set up more like the scrimmages we've seen at Ohio State this spring, where they break down into some teach drills, go out and do some competition, go out and do some red zone, as opposed to, start the ball at the 20 and march down, up and down the field. I guess we'll find that out for sure on Wednesday at the Ryan Day press conference, but I don't think it's going to be your traditional, spring game, ones versus ones, twos versus twos, or offense defense, or however. I think it's going to probably be broken up. I do have questions about, the offensive line, Bill. Like, how do you protect their egos with giving them the opportunity to go out there and get their butts kicked? Like, how do you balance it out? Because if you put the starters out there right now against JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, it's not going well. And I don't mean that just for the backups. I mean, this is not going well for those guys. And Bobby joked about it the other day. And Jack Sawyer as a freshman had 4 sacks in the spring game. How do you prevent that from happening this week? And what are the coaches doing to set up? Because you're not going to allow the linebackers to blitz. We know that. But are there going to be extended periods of time where you're just not going to let the defensive linemen like go? Or how does that work in order to make sure that this competition is actually productive for the quarterbacks? Because if it continues the way that we've seen in practice, I don't think you're going to get much that you really learn about anybody else, because JT Tuimoloau and Michael Hall are just destroying an entire side of the offensive line, and snaps are getting ruined, quickly.
My guess is that the 3 guys you named, JT, Jack, and Mike Hall, are not going to play a whole lot because of those reasons. I think there's a balance there, because on some level, I think it's important for those offensive linemen to experience failure in Ohio Stadium in front of tens of thousands of people, because you have to learn how to overcome those moments when they happen in the game. You're not going to be perfect on every rep once the season starts. So why would that be the expectation now? Or why would the expectation be that, like, we want to help you avoid those situations? Like, you need to learn from them in some regard, but you also can't have the quarterback running around for his life for the entire spring game either. Right. So, that actually is like a really kind of fascinating sort of philosophical question that I maybe now should be a little higher on my list for Ryan Day. Like, how do you manage that with really green offensive linemen? I don't think you worry about that with like Donovan Jackson and Matthew Jones. Just let them go play for a handful of snaps and see how it goes. But you're going to pull those guys out too. You're not going to play those guys 40 snaps in the spring game. So when all those twos are in there and guys who are competing for starting jobs are in there, what is the balance of, okay, let's see how this goes? And also like, oh, we can't continuously have them getting their brains beat in, because at a certain point, maybe that becomes too difficult to overcome. I don't know. I think we've seen some offensive linemen struggle in the spring game before. Like, I think like Paris Johnson didn't have the best spring game last year, and he was okay for that. So perhaps we're making a little bit too much of it, but it is something that's certainly in the back of my mind, and probably in the front of Ryan Day's mind. Like, how do we get these quarterbacks good reps with an offensive line that's still working through some stuff?
Yeah. I mean, that's probably, I know that all ties into the quarterbacks. And so it's kind of, everything sort of goes back to that. But it seems to me to be the one way that the spring game becomes entirely meaningless for both quarterbacks is if they can't even drop back and throw the football. So how do you figure that out? Because I don't think you should be in a position where you're telling young guys like Omari Abor or Kenyatta Jackson or Caden Curry, don't go out there and do your absolute best. Don't go out there and attack, because that's what they're going to do. And I don't think you can't tell Caden Curry not to do that because he would self-destruct. Like he would malfunction, do not, does not compute. So like you'd have to deal with that anyway. But I am interested in how we see those offensive linemen. And that's a list that includes Tegra Shabola and Zen Mahalski and Ben Chrisman and Grant Toutant. And it also includes, Enoch Vamahi, who's sort of been not talked about at all this spring for some reason. But also George Fitzpatrick and Luke Montgomery. Like, how do these guys step up? Austin Saravel, Josh Padilla, like who's gonna be the guy that says, you know what, this is a real big opportunity for me to take some reps and to become a meaningful part of this offensive line unit and ascends that ladder this week? Because I think there is an opportunity for that to happen. It's just about, not going out there and letting, if you lose a rep, letting it take over your mind and dominate you. But what else you got, Bill? What else you got?
I think we might have hit on all. I'm trying to think if there's anything else like super pressing that I have in my head.
There's a lot of things we've talked about this spring that are sort of being from the Department of Redundancy department. I get it. But these are
feels like it.
These things are the things to talk about. There's not a whole lot else. Like you can't really deep dive into, well, how do you guard Marvin Harrison in the spring game? He's not going to play. So who cares? Like, how do you, what's Brian Hartline's play calling going to be like? He's not going to go out there with his 4 best receivers or top 2 running backs, or, what does it matter what he does or calls in this situation versus what it matters or calls in the fall, because you're not going to be playing with the same hand. So I don't know that you gain a lot out of that other than the mechanics of play calling and, trying to match up with Jim Knowles, wit to wit. But I don't think much of that stuff really matters because you are not playing with a full deck.
That maybe raises one more kind of important question for Ryan Day, like the idea that he wanted to create as many game-like atmospheres as possible throughout spring. How close does he feel like he came to accomplishing that? Like, how often does he think they were able to do that, given some of the lighter position groups on defense, especially, but then also too the issues on offensive line that seem to creep up at times? I will say, like, the last time we were in there, which I guess was last Friday, I thought was not quite as bad as it was the time before when like no one could do anything because the offensive line was not blocking anybody. So if that's a sign of like maybe the offensive line was picking some things up and getting a little bit of momentum, maybe it won't be so lopsided on Saturday in the spring game. There's like a small glimmer of hope, I think, that could be the case. But if the number one goal for Ryan Day throughout the spring was to orchestrate game-like atmospheres, how does he think they did with that? I think could be an interesting question for him.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know how the format's going to go. We don't know who's going to win outside of the fans, because the fans are definitely going to win. It's going to be a beautiful day in Columbus, Ohio, 75 degrees or warmer. There is, the chance of an odd spring thunderstorm, but that always happens when it's that nice out. Can't really, worry about it. Free parking, like $7 a ticket, booze in the stadium. Like, what else are you going to do? Show up, be loud. And then you win, and then you don't worry about what happens on the field. You let us worry about that. Let me and Bill and Austin worry about that. If Austin's back by then. If Austin's not back by then, if Austin's not back by then, should we just like ask one of our viewers or subscribers to OhioState.Rivals.com to just join us as the third member of our team that day?
Probably. And when we do that, please wear your most colorful shorts.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously you're taking over Austin's spot, so you're gonna need to make sure you have some really bizarrely colored golf shorts with you, and then B, just show up ready to work. You know what I mean? Bottom line,
that's right.
Bottom line, there's no days off in this business, folks. But there is time off, and we're going to take a few hours off before the Ohio State press conference inside the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. That should be about 11 a.m. or so, maybe a little earlier on Wednesday. You can watch that live on the podcast. You can get reaction from Bill, myself and Austin Ward over at ohiostate.rivals.com. He is still writing this week. He just can't talk, which truthfully is probably best for everyone. So, do with that what you will. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We will catch you on the flip side.